that didn't matter really in the environment that I was growing up in. And as an 11-year-old, you strive to become, for me, the little thoughts back then as 11, got bigger thoughts, became bigger thoughts and bigger thoughts as the older I got. And so this emphasis on, what was driving me, which was being a model and making money and doing that and getting, my attention was coming from that. And so that external facade was the determining factor in my life for many, many years. And even things became critically important for me. I strived to, get material things, and that brought me value, because really inside my self-esteem and what I thought about myself, I had no idea. And so the external stuff became, such an important part of my life, and I didn't have the ability to kind of get a bird's eye view of my life and look at it and go, okay, what's your focus and what's driving you? And there's certain, things in your life, like modeling, which back then was very, very different than it is now. And I'll explain to you a little bit about why. Back then, we had no filters. We had no iPhones. We weren't taking selfies. And it took hours to edit even one picture. And even a single picture, it was a lot of pressure. There were a lot of people that were working, and there was a lot of pressure to be, perfect and no scars, and your hair had to be perfect, and I couldn't have roots. And it was an expensive process to be a model. And it also weighed heavily on your self-esteem. And the idols that came into my life, which we all know what an idol is, any person or thing regarded with blind ambition, adoration, or devotion, the idols that were becoming a force in my life and a focus in my life, and what ultimately I got locked into, were really idols that were self-indulgent and temporary and weren't really fulfilling. So people can also become idols, which they ultimately did in my life as well. So my modeling career began. That was actually a guest modeling picture. I was a guest model after Claudia Schiffer. And I worked for the top agency in St. Louis and Chicago, and I missed a lot of school and I traveled. But there was this little whisper inside of me that really wanted to be a writer. And so I would write these little short stories and put them under my bed. And I would think to myself, someday, if I had enough courage, I'd start to write. But I didn't have the confidence. I mean, I was getting weighed in at the modeling agency, and if I was off by 1 pound, I was in trouble. So this whole focus on, what I looked like and what I ate and what I, that all the external became just the absolute focus in my life. And so, and also in school, these were the things that to me were taught that were becoming more important, not the straight A's that I had, but more my attitude and always being on, always being that, happy and putting on this kind of fake facade. And what can happen is we get into these comfort zones, right? We get into these habits, like these little habits become bigger habits, and these comfort zones that we think are helping us and protecting us can actually hurt us and go against us. And when I was transitioning to college, I actually applied to 9 different colleges and got into all of them. And some of them were writing schools and very accomplished writing schools. But I went back to my comfort zone, and my comfort zone was, no, I was going to pick a city that had a big modeling presence, and I was going to stay in my little bubble of what I thought was, what I was worth, right? And I didn't think that I had the courage to take that opportunity, which college, right? It's an opportunity. It's a time in your life where you can make a different choice. And for me, I could have looked at that time as a pivotal time in my life, and I didn't choose to do that. So I went on to SMU, which was a high pressure school, and you can imagine my career ramped up, and I started traveling in college, and I ultimately went to I worked for that top agency in Dallas, and I went to Barcelona to work for Elite Worldwide, and I lived in the modeling agency. And this was a pivotal time for me in my life, and I could have gone one way or the other, right? If I had gone to the schools that for writing, I would have maybe my self-esteem would have been nurtured, and I would have gone to a different route, and my life would have really definitely changed. But the pressure was mounting, right, in my life, and the scars that were forbidden were I was so worried about being scarred up all of the time. And I'll never forget, there was this one when I went on a shoot to Bride magazine. I was picked to be on the cover of Bride magazine, and I went to the shoot, and actually they said they made me go home because I had roots. And I'll never forget the conversation that my modeling agency called me, and they were like shouting at me, and they just said, "How did you not get your hair colored?" And I looked in the mirror, I was like, my hair looks great. But it was that, just those external forces that were just driving my life. And I just bought into that. I bought into that way of life, and I chose it, right? I mean, ultimately I chose it. And also during that whole time, I also believed that relationships were transactional. Some of that was, portrayed to me, but really through my career, that was shown to me. For example, photographers and agents, they would say, agencies would say to clients, well, I'll do this for you if you do this for me. I'll get you this girl for this price if you do this for me, if you use our agency for this. And I kept watching all of this go on, and I thought, literally, that's just the way life works, is that if I do something for somebody, they'll want to do something for me. And that whole way of thinking was just distorting my life. So ultimately, I got married and I had kids, and, I had this persona, right, of this life was good and everything that I ever wanted, I got. And, but there was this like yearning inside for something different. Like I didn't know who I was, like who was I inside? I knew what I was outside, but I had no idea what I was outside. And this day in and day out of working in this environment really, truly, I believed, and who I was what I looked like. And after I got married and had kids, there was just kind of this still there was just something missing, and I couldn't put my fingers on it. And again, if I had taken a bigger picture of my life and kind of taken the bird's eye view, I probably would have said, this is your focus, right? Like this is what you're focusing on. But I didn't do that. I didn't spend the time to do that. And again, could have been a very pivotal moment in my life, but I kept going. I decided that I was going to stay in that comfort zone of what I knew. So then I started to get sick. And, I grew up in a wealthy environment and kind of an enabling environment. And I just thought, these sorts of illnesses, they weren't going to affect me, which was kind of silly looking back now. And I had a torn ligament in my right wrist. And my arm story is an important story because I was really taught to stay in my lane. And what my lane was listening to authority and not questioning authority. And so I had a torn ligament in my right wrist. And my wrist after the surgery really exploded. Like my wrist looked like my thigh bone. And I went back to my doctor, and he said, you're fine. It's just all in your head. And I didn't question him. He told me I had this thing called RSD, and that was basically your brain was telling your limb that there was a problem, but there really wasn't. And so he sent me to physical therapy for months, and he made these very interesting casts for me to pull and make some movement in my wrist when there wasn't any, because ultimately what I found out was that I had a infection in my wrist the whole time, but I didn't have the courage to stand up to him or go see a second opinion. And I gave that bullish doctor, more authority in my life than I gave myself, because I was following the rules and I was staying in my lane. And this burden of thinking that he was the authority was really becoming kind of an idol in my life. But ultimately, because of my arm, my idols of bags and handbags and, oh, I love Birkin bags and, oh, I'm going to collect them and all this stuff. I couldn't even carry a Birkin bag anymore. And so I thought to myself, like, what's happening here? Like all of this emphasis that I'm putting on these things and this facade, these scars. I mean, I can't believe I have scars now. I can't believe my life has turned into this. And I just couldn't figure out what was happening. And then I got breast cancer, which, kind of added insult to injury, so to speak. And this picture is one of my friends snapped it, and that's me getting my hair cut right before I was about to lose my hair. And I couldn't believe that my hair was going to be gone. And so this perfect facade, these idols, they were all crumbling down. And it was like I had to die to myself in order to rebuild and to figure out like what was life about. It wasn't, the hair and the roots and the modeling agency and the stuff and the bags and the, people, who was in my life. And it was at this moment where I decided that I had to figure out, during those chemotherapies, I decided, you know what, I can either be too busy trying to get away from this, get out of this chemotherapy, or I can say to myself, there's got to be purpose in this pain. There's got to be some reason why this is all happening. And so I decided that I was going to be a student of the pain. And when I can tell you that when you are in the ICU version of yourself, of your emotional self, which is maybe a new concept for some of you, but I've been in that ICU version of my emotional self too many times. It really can be a measure of learning. And, I was physically in the ICU many times, but when I finally, died to myself and said, I can't really go on like I'm living, right? I can't really have the purpose of my life can't just be the external and the people who are in my life. It had to be more, I had to have something deeper than that. And so when you really do look at the icy version of your emotional self, it's a time, right, that we can create a timeout, but that's also a choice. We have to discern that, right, and make sure that we are using that time as a timeout instead of running away from that pain. For me, it became my time of self-reflection and in some ways, some rest. I mean, obviously it was very, very sick and there was not a lot of, peaceful resting going on. But it was an opportunity for me to, have lost everything that I believed in to be my life and everything that I believed in to be truth and everything that I believed in to be my life-giving force. And I just said, this isn't working. And how am I gonna shift it? And also during that time, I made the decision not to add another problem to the problem, right? I was going through chemotherapy. I just had a fused arm. And by adding another problem, I could have said, okay, well, now I'm going to pick up a bottle of alcohol. Now I'm going to cope with another idol. And so it's time, when you get to this ICU emotional time, you have to be very careful of what you put your time and energy into. And so after all those illnesses and after, that childhood, I decided, okay, now how am I going to rebuild? And these were all very conscious decisions. This didn't just happen. I studied like, how am I going to rebuild my life? And what do I want in my life going forward? And who do I want in my life? Right. And what voices am I listening to? And so when I was knocked down, which, a lot of us are getting knocked down right now, the whole world is getting knocked down with the pandemic. But it's how do we get back up? And again, we can be so busy during the storm running away from it that you don't really take note of, how to use your purpose in pain. But for me, I knew that I had to have something different to move forward. And I had a ton of people. I had a ton of women. I had such a huge support system who really stood by me and stood up for me and were my hands and feet, until I could regain, kind of control of my life. And I mean, when I tell you I went through 28 rounds of chemo, that is 15 months of every single week showing up for chemotherapy. But I also, during that time, thought that those women were the heroes. Like what they did for me was heroic, which is true, but we have to be the heroes in our own story. I was the one that went to bed with cancer. I was the one that woke up with cancer. I was the one that had to have my port, stuck with chemo 28 times and well, more than that actually, because you have to go to the hospital when you're really sick. And I ended up being in the ICU many times. And so people can become idols in our life. And, we see that with celebrities, right? But it's so, there's no substance there, right? And so that's why we really have to be the heroes in our own story and remember that people can be our guide and they can help us. But we have to be our biggest cheerleaders. And until I figured that out, I was really very lost and very self-impressed by other people and very self-indulgent with other people. But ultimately, I did figure out that I was more than skin deep. And I had to remember who I was seeing, right? Like who was showing up on my social media? Who was I admiring? And what was I listening to? And what was going on between the voices in my head, my own dialogue? I had to really stop and think about, what was I saying to myself? And, I remembered that bullish doctor, and I couldn't believe, that I had believed him and I didn't go see a second opinion. But if you look at, the focus that was on my life, it makes sense that that's what I would do. And for me, I had an opportunity and I was very grateful. Of course, it's not the first opportunity I would have chosen to get breast cancer and to have a fused arm, but it was an opportunity for me to really look at my life and go, okay, what is not working here? And so I really had to start listening to, what was I saying to myself? And I caught myself saying like, well, that was a really stupid decision, or you shouldn't have said that. And, had all this shame, this guilt. And when I was, healing from chemotherapy and all these illnesses, I was like, I can't believe I'm talking to myself that way. I can't believe I'm letting other people talk to me badly, but really I was talking badly to myself. And I realized that what you really believe about yourself, you become. And that's a scary thing. And so ultimately, I was brave enough and I built my self-esteem enough through my friends, through the help of other people, and through my faith, but also, from these lessons that I decided that I was going to learn from, and I was going to choose to use those lessons as kind of a purposeful guide in my life. I decided that I was going to use that to help other people as well. And so ultimately, that writing that I used to do and hiding them under my bed and those little short stories that I wrote, I decided that I was going to take a stab at that. And I wrote a book called Walk Beside Me, which has become a bestseller and is actually being made into a film. And it really did stem from that self-awareness and that self-love that I wasn't giving myself for so long, but I finally had the courage to do it. I finally had the courage to come out of that comfort zones, right? And I finally had the courage to take that bird's eye view of my life and go, what is the focus here? And what do I want to focus on in the future? And so ultimately, this idea of successful invisibility is such an important one. Who was I doing it for? And what are we doing it for? So I started to live my life really not for myself and not for vanity, and not for the approval of others, but to serve others. And I decided that serving and self-love, this genuine genuine serving, was what I was going to go forward with. And that's how I was going to get through my life. And that really created resilience inside of me, because I got out of my head. I got out of, oh my gosh, how could I ever, how did I get breast cancer? And now I have scars. And, in that old stage of my life, I would have looked at my scars and been ashamed of them. Right. But then I looked at my scars and I was like, I'm going to use these to help other people. And a lot of people, throughout my story would say, you just think positively. And as a motivational thinker, I think that's the biggest piece of crap. I don't think that just saying to somebody, well, just think positively, does anything. In fact, it just makes people feel ashamed, because that's not what they're thinking, right? You don't automatically just think positive. Like for me, I live in chronic pain. I mean, chronic pain. My arm hurts all the time. And I could live in fear, right? Fear of, getting cancer back, because I had a very aggressive form of cancer. And so, positive thinking, sure, that might be very helpful for me, but I don't want people to think that that's going to get you out of trauma. That's going to get you out of, the difficulties in your life, because you can't just turn a switch and go, okay, well, now I'm going to think positively. And resilience is also more about perseverance and courage. And more importantly than anything, it's about your focus. What are you focused on in your life? And once I was centered, right, in a focus that meant something and that could sustain me, and it wasn't built on sand, and I wasn't, falling into this hole. And once I chose purpose and pain, and serving became a priority, I had to get really creative with that serving, because it was super easy to write a check, and I am all for that, and I completely believe in it, and I do it. But I wanted to go deeper, and then I wanted to get dirty, and I really wanted to get more creative with it. And so when I've been in the hospital, and even recently, I think about, like, how can I serve here? Like, I'm in a hospital bed. What can I do? Right? I can't feed the poor, right, from the hospital bed. So I decided that, I was going to embrace my failures, and I was embrace the things that I had done wrong, and the decision-making process that I had focused on. And so I just started to walk around the hall in the hospitals, and I started to, knock on people's hospital rooms and said, "How you doing?" And I didn't want to be in that world anymore of just these shallow conversations. Like, I legitimately wanted to have a conversation with these people in the hospital saying, "How are you doing and how can I help you?" And recently I was in the hospital 3 times during COVID, not from COVID. And the first time I was in the hospital, which was the end of March, we were allowed to leave our rooms. And so I'd literally walk around the halls and knock on people's doors 6 feet apart and ask people how they were doing, and have these really unbelievable conversations with people who were suffering, by the way. And and then the next time I was there a month later for the same exact reason. I had a staph infection in my breast. And a month later, we weren't allowed to leave our rooms. But interestingly enough, the nurses and the staff on that same floor that I was on a month earlier, they all remembered me. They were like, "Oh, you were that girl that, the patients, when you left, were talking about you. And you were that girl that, you really inspired, or you really, you were a light to this person." And I thought, wow, I do have a voice. I never, ever really believed that I had a voice. I never really believed that I could change, anything in the world. And that I just, I proved that once I changed my focus, that I could really have a big impact on the world. And the thing about gratitude is, because a lot of times motivational speakers will talk about gratitude, and gratitude is imperative, and it's such a simple concept. But I never really aligned myself with gratitude. I just kind of dismissed it. But once I really aligned myself with being grateful and writing it down, it really did shift. It became a bigger shift in my life, and purposeful. So it's very, very important. And some of the coping mechanisms that I used, I believe in, I have a certain faith, and I'm very strong in my faith. And I believe that meditation, prayer, mantras that we set for ourselves, whatever prayer you pray or whatever mantra you decide to use, we need these things to go back to, right? Because obviously we're going through these roller coasters every single day. And so when I was anxious or I was fearful, I would say to myself over and over again, "I am okay. I will get through this." And whatever thing you can say to yourself, I would strongly recommend that you find a mantra. And just when you get in those moments where you just can't, you're digging a deeper hole and you're getting anxious, go back to your mantra and just say, "I'm okay. I can get through this. Look what I've done. I am grace. I am grit," and build yourself back up. I also use exercise as kind of a way of coping. Usually when I have stress in my life these days, I'll go for a walk and kind of get out of my head and listen to a podcast and try to get some peace, right? To get away from our home and just get outside. And then there's this thing called dominoes, which I think is so interesting. And I learned about this when I was going through chemotherapy. But when we have one problem, and it affects one area of our life, like for me, it was my health. But if I had come home and I had like taken out my fear and my anger on my kids or my husband or my friends or whatever, then now I'm creating 2 problems, right? And it's got the domino effect. And so I didn't want to have all the segments of my life impacted because of my chemotherapy. I wanted to nurture my friendships. I wanted to still, try to maintain as much of a balance in my house as I possibly could. And so I just think that's something that we should remember, because oftentimes we're in these traumatic stages of our life or seasons of our life. That happens a lot, where people, they just can't, all of the areas of their life are impacted. And I think if we see those areas of our life separately and try to keep them separate, that can be a really good coping mechanism. Empathy and compassion is an interesting concept in our world. We really are equipped with endless amounts of empathy and compassion. We aren't really equipped with the amount of courage that really it takes, I think, to live in this world. There were times in my life where I felt no courage, and I had to build that back up. But if we are empathetic and compassionate to people, really, we have unlimited supply. So we should just be giving that out like confetti. And when we do that, and when we can we are compassionate to other people and empathetic to other people, it's almost selfish, like our life changes. It goes back to that focus on serving. And so that's such a critical tool that we can use. So in conclusion, I'd like to go back to that definition of beauty, which changed very different for me, because truly the real beauty in life, it comes from within, right? It comes from looking within. It comes from getting deeper into relationships with other people. But we have to have an effort to do that. Like we really have to dive down deeper into relationships and kind of get rid of that fluff and that, surface. Hey, how you doing? Oh, great. How are you doing? Really develop these relationships. So since I wrote my book and became a motivational speaker, I went on the board of a company called eBeauty, which I don't know if you guys have looked up. But eBeauty is a wig exchange program. And when I was going through chemotherapy, I had the ability to buy lots of wigs. And one of my friends would come into my house and pick up my wigs, and she would wash them. And then another friend would pick them up from her house, and then they would go braid them, and then they'd deliver them back to me. But some people can't afford a wig. And so this organization, which started by somebody that I know, people, after they're finished with their treatment, they can send their wigs to this organization, and Paul Mitchell salons, they wash them, and then they ship them out to people that need one, that don't have the ability to, they can't afford one. And so I think that this is an incredible organization that, I hope that you all might want to contribute to. But anyway, I just thought, giving you a little bird's eye view of my life and how I got to be where I am would be interesting and could impart some wisdom on you. So thank you for listening. And I would love to take some questions. And I think I'll unshare my screen.
Great. So thank you so much, Christine. I think we have a question in the chat function, which is, what kept you positive during this time of self-exploration?
Like during the illnesses, I'm assuming?
Andrea, is that what you meant?
Well, I think that's what you meant. So
yeah.
I think first of all kept me positive was the relationships that I had, my friends, because they really stepped up and said, okay, your life is worth living. Your life matters, and we're going to teach you why. And so I had those women, which is so critical as to who we surround ourselves with, because I could have had friends that didn't pour into me, and my life right now I may not be here talking to you, but they were so encouraging that they helped me. They elevated my positivity, because I didn't feel very positive at the time. I was kind of in shock, but I was also, my life the rug had really come out from underneath me, and I didn't know how to rebuild, but they really helped me.
We have another question, thank you, which was, what was this like for your children?
So I believe that fear translates into anger. And I had two boys. They were 11 and 13 during that process, and they didn't want to see their mom sick. And so they kind of kept me at arm's distance. And I'll never forget, I was in New York City one time during chemo, and I went to a wig, like a specialist that made beautiful wigs when you were there. And my son was in town with me, and I met him, we met him at a restaurant, and he walked in, and I didn't have any hair, and I had this beautiful brunette wig on, and they walked right by my table. They didn't even see me. And once my son realized it was me, he walked over and he pulled the wig off my head and threw it across the room, because he was so afraid of his mom looking different that he wanted me to have the blonde wigs. He wanted me to, even though I had no hair, he didn't want to see me bald. He wanted me to look just the way I was. And so for them, I think they were so scared that I was going to die that they really kept me at a distance. I think that's the biggest thing that happened to them.
Another question is, which support systems really helped you come out of all that suffering?
It was definitely my friendships, even more than my family. I had a ton of women that, stood by me. And I think for me, the men in my life were were kind of detached and they were afraid, but the women, they were all in. And, they taught me, again, they nurtured my self-esteem back up. They nurtured me back up. They took care of my family. They took care of, I had a friend who made a schedule every week for different friends to come in to really help me. And there was a need for that. I was, I just gotten my arm had just been fused, and I was going through chemotherapy, and I was really, really sick. And so I think those women were my biggest support system. And once I was well, then they basically said, okay, now it's your turn. Now you go do that for other people.
Wow. It's a legacy that they left you, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Lucky. But I think it's important that we take inventory of, right, who we surround ourselves with before all, because we're going to go through traumas. That's guaranteed. So we have to really figure out who's on our side, who's on our team. And I tell people all the time, take inventory. And if there are people that are tearing you down, you have to gently get rid of those people in your life.
Some good advice for all of us. What other questions do you all have?
I have a question. Christine, you're so inspiring. And I really want to thank you for sharing, these incredible personal but difficult challenges in your life, and really how you came on the other side of it, and are now such an inspirational message to all of us who have the opportunity to hear you and meet you. By the way, my son is at SMU.
Oh, I loved it. I mean, that's one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was a great school.
Yeah, great school, and he loves it and has made amazing friendships there.
Yes.
I was wondering, given that you went through this whole process with your arm with misguided diagnosis and treatment, one obvious takeaway is get more opinions. But when you do get other opinions, and we all have medical issues, we'll have medical issues, our family, what is your advice on what you look for and what you might miss, that you could impart to us as we try to understand what the best treatments or relationship is with the doctor?
I have a lot of answers for that. I did not cause what happened to my arm, but for a long time, I believed that because I didn't have the self-esteem that I should have, that I should have seen another doctor, that it was because of me, and it wasn't. I didn't go to medical school, and I don't have a medical degree. And because I was taught to respect and not challenge authority, should not have led that doctor to doing what he did. He was a bully. He actually lied to me. He said that I didn't have an infection when in fact he did have the information that I did have an infection. And so that obviously cost me, because I'm in pain every single day. And that was 10 years ago. And then it was really hard to trust any authority after that, and then I was diagnosed with cancer, and I had to go interview oncologists, and I was like, I can't even imagine trusting a doctor. And then to make it worse, my arm was just fused. I ended up going to HSS in New York City, and my arm was fused, and I had bone grafts, and I had a cadaver bone put in. And so I'm in a cast from my fingertips to my shoulder, and I'm diagnosed with cancer. And the oncologist that I meet, who I ended up trusting, and he was a wonderful human being, and he actually rebuilt my trust in doctors. But he said to me, he looked at me square in the eyes, and he said, we can't start chemotherapy for 30 days because all those grafts that are now in your arm, they'll dissolve. So not only did I have a doctor that mistreated me and misdiagnosed me, but now I was scared to death, right, that I'm gonna die of cancer. And now I have to push off treatment for cancer because of my arm.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, and there are so many stories within my story that are absolutely nutty, which most people, who see me, they say, you present so well, like you would never know that happened to you, which in the medical field is actually a bad thing. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of times when you go in and you look healthy and you look like, I often go into the doctor very positive and whatever, they discount how you feel. And I've been told that by surgeon, by the way. And so I think when you go into an appointment, I do think that we have to trust authority because they are the ones that do go to medical school. But I also think that you always have to have a second opinion. And unfortunately, I learned that the hard way. And I also think that you need to, for me, I didn't have the self-esteem to really vocally say, I don't really believe you. Maybe we should, do a blood test, or maybe, I didn't have the courage to say that to the doctor. So I think that maybe make a list of questions you like to go into the doctor's office and ask them. And, that part of that is, comes from self-esteem. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We have a couple more questions in the chat, Christine. One is, I know it's naive or simplistic, but I'm struck by what you describe as a lack of self-esteem, which on a superficial level seems anathema to having an early career as a model. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you forged into that particular career, given the insecurity that you describe?
Right. I don't think my self-esteem was bad when I started modeling. I think my self-esteem got worse throughout my career because, a lot of the stepping stones to become a successful model, especially to the level that I got, you're really told all the time, you're not thin enough. You don't look like you should. You got to go do this. You've got to go work out more. You can't eat that. They weight us in. And so I think over time, my self-esteem kind of got slaughtered, but I didn't recognize it at the time. I didn't notice it. And I think that oftentimes the prettiest people in the room, like if you walk into a dinner party and you see this like beautiful person, you think that person has the most highest self-esteem, is the most secure, has the most friends. And the truth is that person probably is the loneliest, because oftentimes, because I know from talking to other models, and I've been a model for 90% of my life, oftentimes the models are very lonely because people are afraid to go up to them. They're intimidated by them. And so I think that, my self-esteem, as it got worse, I still had the agility to fight to get other work because I was desperate, right, for it, right? I was depending on the jobs to sustain my self-esteem. And so to the outside world, right, it looked like I had a great self-esteem, but inside it kept getting, chopped away.
Great, thank you. I think a follow-on question to that, sorry, I'm trying to read while we're talking here, is, has this sense of self that you built become your natural default, or do you still find yourself fighting your earlier impulses?
I don't fight the self-esteem issues. I do find that I get into the fear-based issues. And, the fear-based issues back then were kind of, I'm not good enough. I don't really get into that, but I get into the, what if I get cancer back? And what if I get sick again? And that fear-based is a really unhealthy way to live. And so I really have to fight that. But my self-esteem is based on not what I look like, but it's based on my faith. And so that is kind of unwavering now. But that's been a lifelong, battle. And so I've just kind of gotten here over the past like 5 or 6 years. So, and I'm going to keep forging through that.
So here's a question moving on from the topic of self-esteem about your book. And why did you title your book Walk Beside Me a novel? Is it really a novel?
So it's a fictional depiction of my life. And ultimately, the only differences between the truth and the book are I changed the cities and I changed the names. And that was really a decision kind of last minute. And I don't know if it was the right one or the wrong one, but I just decided that I needed to be a little bit, although I was very vulnerable in my book, I needed to be a little bit kind of anonymous in it. Which maybe if you read it, it'll make sense. But yeah, I mean, I am very, in my life, I'm very vulnerable right now because I think vulnerability is a tool, right? It's the greatest tool to teaching other people. It's the greatest tool to inspiring because, we can all put on this fake facade, which I did for many years. It does nothing to help other people.
And Christine, I know you've written a second book. What's the status of that one?
So the second book I wrote is very different from my first book, and it's not totally in line with the brand I've already built, because it's the first three chapters are true, and everything after that is made up. But my first book is a really wholesome kind of look at my life, and there's parts of it that are unflattering for me, but in general, it's kind of a wholesome book. And my second book, there's sex scenes and nothing like outrageous, but it's just a very different. It's a different animal. So I'm actually, I go to Harvard right now. I'm getting my master's degree in creative writing. And I wrote the second book like 3 years ago. And I couldn't really come to grips with whether I was going to publish it or not. And now I definitely am going to publish it. But because I'm in school and I'm watching how much different my ability is to write, I'm getting so much better. Imagine that, Harvard's working. So I'm just going back and editing that book. And so it will come out eventually.
Right. So we have something to look forward to.
Yes.
So I think getting back to the topic of beauty, right, and the fact that you've been obviously blessed with this incredible beauty, there is a question here wondering about this trade-off between beauty and health. And obviously at the moment you've been lucky enough not to have it, but have you had any thoughts about that?
The trade-off between beauty and health. I think I understand the question. I would have maybe preferred to just stay beautiful and maybe never learned these lessons. Maybe that would have been easier. I don't know. But because, my beauty was stripped away for a very long time, I ultimately, shifted, right? And so would I be a different person right now? Definitely. And I hope that, most people don't have to go through the trauma that I had to go through to learn those lessons. And if I had been able to be beautiful and to be who I am inside and to know who I was inside, that would have been the perfect equation. That just didn't happen for me. So I don't know if I answered the question, but it definitely was a trade-off.
Thank you. So we have a few compliment things they aren't actually questions. Compliments in the chat, things like, I've never seen you bitter or sour, from your friend Cyril, during the last year, although you endured all these pains. And I guess the follow on to that, though, is what do you think in its essence really helps you keep smiling all the time?
Definitely my faith. So I have this amazing group of friends, but I ultimately moved away from them, and not because I wanted to, but I lived in Dallas and I went through all that trauma there, and I love Dallas. I love the city. I love the people there. But, everywhere I looked around, I thought, oh, that's where I went through chemo. That's where my arm doctor was. I had surgery there. And I needed to get out of that city. And so I moved away and I went to Miami, and I really had to stand on my own 2 feet, right? That was like really standing on my own 2 feet. I didn't know anybody. I had to make new friends. And, that took a lot of courage. But the thing that I realized in making that move, and also, getting healthy, they weren't around all the time when I was healthy. What I realized was it was my faith. Like, it was my faith in God. It was my faith in prayer and who was I serving, right? And think for all of us, we are serving something, and we have to decide what is that you're serving. And so for me, I decided that I was going to serve, God.
Thank you. So that ends our chat questions. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts for Christine? You can just take yourself off mute. You could be a little less formal here.
I have a question. It's a really interesting story. My sister's going through chemotherapy right now, and her kids are acting out. And I was just wondering how that ended up. How did they reconcile? How did you help them kind of come to terms with it?
Yeah, mine isn't the best. Mine isn't in that regard the most hopeful story. My kids really, they were really angry at me for getting sick, and I had a fair amount of illness. I didn't just have breast cancer, and so they are still struggling with that. We got them therapy, but then they're boys. They didn't have the words to emote, and so they kept it inside. And they've had some trouble with school and becoming men, because I think they've kind of carried this anger. So it's still a work in progress. but it's been very hard for them. And and again, fear translates into anger. Whether you're a child or an adult, it just does. And so if we recognize that, right? If your sister says that maybe to her kids or to her family, and, because I kind of learned it after, that would be very helpful, I'm sure. So they can recognize it, and go, oh, wow, this is my reaction, right, to fear.
It's hard. Yeah.
It is so hard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Christine? Oh, I see another one in the chat. What role do you wish your husband had through all of this, and what advice do you give to the partner of somebody who's suffering?
I wish somebody would write a book on that. Because actually my book, I'm pretty honest about what happened in my relationship, and we've been estranged for several years. He was like the children, and that fear kind of pushed me away. I think the statistic, and I'm not positive on this, is 70% of women that go through breast cancer, end up in divorce. So I think a lot of times the husbands become estranged from their wives, maybe out of fear. I'm not sure. I asked him for many years, like, why did he, kind of push away from me? And he doesn't have the answer. So I don't know.
Thank you. Any other questions I think clearly there's a lot of thank yous in the chat function about your honesty and how, gracious you've been in sharing what are obviously very, very personal aspects of your story with all of us. So thank you so much. Does anybody have any last questions? No?
Just thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. This was really, I think, a powerful reminder for everybody about the value of friendships, the value of really being introspective and understanding who you are and how you can really be meaningful to others. So in a way that I think a lot of us just forget in sort of our day-to-day, get busy lives.
Yeah, I think I did that for a long time, right? But if you end up, looking from the bird's eye view down at your life, you go, okay, what's working? Where am I focused? I think that can be a real transition in your life. And so I'm very happy that I made the decision to, kind of change. Anyway, thank you for everybody for listening and for being part of this. And thank you, Joy, for all the opportunities you give us to listen.
Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Christine. This was really fabulous.
Thank you.
So much appreciate your honesty and your genuineness with everybody.
And motivation.
Yes, and motivation, as Lori has said. And looking forward to seeing so many of you on Wednesday when we actually go to a totally different topic and go to a brand new museum in Washington, D.C., Planet Word, which I think actually relates very well to your story, Christine, because it's all about the power of words. So, okay. Well, thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Joyce.
Bye.